The smell of the good, damp earth always meant honesty to me. It meant work, legacy, and a kind of quiet permanence that only land can offer. But on that overcast Tuesday, the honesty was gone, and all I could smell was the cheap cologne of ambition and the faint, dusty scent of betrayal clinging to my kitchen curtains. I had been Evelyn Vance for 72 years. And for 50 of those years, I had believed one simple truth. Family meant unbreakable trust. My nephew Mark and his wife Chloe dismantled that belief with a single sheet of paper and a smile. So wide it looked like a tear in their faces. They stood right where I am standing now. In my small, sun-drenched cottage, the only remaining structure on what used to be the Vance Ranch. Mark held a sheaf of documents. He looked like the picture of the successful young real estate magnate he claimed to be. All tailored suit and polished leather shoes that had never seen a speck of dirt. Chloe, with her perfectly sculpted blonde hair and that diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, kept fluttering her hand to her throat, playing the part of the anxious, loving relative. Aunt Evelyn. Mark's voice was smooth, like oil on glass. We've gone over the final details for the transfer. It's all straightforward. This is just the formal signing, the last formality, thank goodness. He pushed the paper toward me across the pine kitchen table, the same table where I taught him to play poker and make biscuits. It was a quitclaim deed. It transferred the last 2 acres of the Vance property, the 2 acres containing this old cottage, the dilapidated barn, and the deep-shaded well to his holding company. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to sign. I had promised him the land. But because of the name of the project Mark was launching, the Vance Legacy Estates. I had told him the name felt too grand, too boastful. He just patted my hand and laughed it off, assuring me it was a tribute to my late husband. Arthur, it's just the final stretch. Aunt E, Chloe chimed in, leaning over my shoulder, the scent of expensive perfume making me feel slightly dizzy. We're going to build something truly special here. Something you'll be proud of. Proud? The word tasted flat and empty. I picked up the pen. My hand, steady from years of driving heavy machinery and tending a challenging garden, faltered for a second. That brief, instinctual hesitation that was the last flicker of my old self, the trusting woman they were about to erase. And the amount, Mark? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He gave a dismissive wave. Oh, that's just a formality. The $10,000 is already in your account, Auntie. It's a gift, really, 'cause the land itself, as you know, is basically worthless. The city classified it as undevelopable swamp. The value is symbolic. $10,000. A symbolic gift for the land where my husband and I had built a life. Where we buried 3 dogs and a lifetime of dreams. I signed the paper. The scratching of the pen was the loudest sound in the room. Mark snatched the document back as if it might spontaneously combust. The mask of polite concern dropped instantly. His eyes, usually crinkled with practiced warmth, went cold, flat, and triumphant. Thank you, Aunt Evelyn, he said, folding the document neatly. His tone was now strictly business, no longer family. The closing team will handle the rest. You have 2 weeks to clear the house. 2 weeks. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. 2 weeks. Mark, we agreed on 3 months for me to relocate. Chloe laughed. It was a brittle, sharp sound, like stepping on dry glass. Oh, Evelyn, darling. Things change. We start site prep immediately. The whole 2 acres are going to be excavated next month for the foundation of the main clubhouse. We need the space. You understand? The shock wasn't just in the timeline. It was in the naked hostility. I looked from Chloe's triumphant smirk to Mark's averted gaze. He couldn't meet my eyes. He was ashamed, but not enough to stop. You said the land was undevelopable, I stated, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Mark finally spoke, his voice hard. Things changed, as Chloe said. We found an incredible way to drain the subsurface New German tack. Expensive, but worth it. The main clubhouse, the pool deck, the tennis courts, said all goes right here. He gestured toward my perennial flower beds. Prime real estate. You would be so proud. He used the word again, proud, twisting the knife of family sentiment. They left as quickly as they came, leaving behind only the cold vacuum of their ambition. They hadn't even finished the tea I offered. I stood there, watching the dust settle where their luxury SUV had been. The quitclaim deed signed, sealed, and delivered. My life savings gone. My home forfeit, my trust shattered. All for $10,000 and a lie. I walked to the window. The sun was almost setting, and the shadow of the giant oak that used to shade the main ranch house fell across the back acreage. I could see the surveyor's flags Mark's team had planted, not random markers, but the precise outline of a massive foundation. They didn't just steal my land. They stole my peace. They stole my legacy. And they left me with nothing but this old cottage, which now felt less like a home and more like a prison. Cell waiting to be demolished. The tears that threatened to come were not tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of cold, focused rage. A matriarch who is built and maintained for decades does not go quietly into the night. She redraws the battle lines. Mark had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He saw an old woman. He saw a 2-acre swamp. He did not see the architect who designed the city's infrastructure 40 years ago. And he certainly did not see the master plan hidden beneath the dirt. They had stolen the land. Now, they were about to find out that I still owned the wires, the pipes, and the control. The next morning, I did not call an attorney. I did not call a grief counselor. I did not call a moving truck. I called a plumber, specifically old Silas, who used to work for the city water department back when my late husband, Arthur, was still running the show. Silas knew more about the city's pipe system than the mayor and the entire city council combined. I found him tending his prize-winning dahlias in his backyard. A man whose spine was permanently curved from years of hauling iron pipes through trenches. "Evelyn," he said, wiping his hands on a faded apron. "Long time. Heard about your land? Terrible shame what those youngsters are doing." I handed him a flask of Arthur's Reserve whiskey. He unscrewed the top, took a long, thoughtful sip, and passed it back. The communication was silent, complete. "Silas," I said, "I need to know everything you know about the utility lines running through the Vance property, especially the old sections. Before the big bypass, before the new city charter, when the only thing that mattered was moving water." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Now that's a blast from the past. You talking about the Central Feed Line 3, aren't you? The one everyone thought they rerouted in '88? Tell me, Silas," I urged, leaning in. He chuckled, the sound rattling in his chest. "Arthur and we laid that line ourselves. It was meant to service the industrial park down the river, but the city was always short on cash. So when Mark's father sold off the original 100 acres to the state for a tax break, we struck a temporary deal." Silas lowered his voice, though no one else was within 50 yards. "The city gave Arthur permanent, non-revocable maintenance access to that line. The line runs right under your 2 remaining acres, Evelyn. And it doesn't just feed the industrial park anymore. When they built the new northern housing development 10 years ago, they tied it in as the main pressure source. Without that feed line, the entire north side of the city loses 60% of its water pressure." I stared at him. The $10,000 check from Mark, which I hadn't cashed, suddenly felt like a joke played by a small child. Mark had spent millions draining the undevelopable swamp to build his luxury clubhouse. He had done a title search, an environmental survey, and a geological survey. He had paid for everything except a conversation with the old woman who signed the deed. And what about access, Silas? When they start excavating for that clubhouse foundation, Mark wants to build on my garden. What happens to your pipe? That's the beauty of Arthur's deal, Evelyn. He got the access for free, but he kept the control. The master utility easement, he called it. The official document is buried so deep in the county archives, no one's seen it in 30 years. It grants the easement holder the right to unfettered, unannounced access for maintenance and repair at any time for any duration. And Evelyn, it explicitly states that any construction obstructing that access is subject to immediate demolition and fines. My mind was reeling, connecting the dots. Mark bought the land, but he didn't buy the ground beneath it. He didn't buy the air rights or the permanent infrastructure access. He simply bought the right to build on top of a system I still controlled. Silas, who officially holds that easement now. He grinned, showing a gap where a tooth used to be. Well, when Arthur passed, all his business interests, including all intellectual and contractual property, reverted to you, Evelyn. You hold the master utility easement for Feedline 3. The realization was a cold, pure shock of power. They hadn't just stolen a piece of my history. They had built their entire future on a ticking time bomb, and I held the detonator. Now, Evelyn, why are you asking? You're not I'm thinking of doing some deep, thorough, and very necessary maintenance, Silas. The kind that takes a long, long time. I stood up, the old rage replaced by a terrifying calm. I didn't need to sue them. I didn't need to beg them. I just needed to exercise my legal right to turn off the water. The next 2 weeks were a strange ballet of power and ignorance. Mark and Chloe were everywhere, their white SUV zipping in and out of the construction site. They brought in massive bulldozers, concrete trucks, and a crew that looked far too aggressive for simple grading. They were racing against my deadline, determined to break ground on the clubhouse before I was physically gone. I stayed silent. I waved to the contractors. I even offered them iced tea, playing the part of the slightly senile, sweet old lady they expected. I listened to Chloe on her phone, pacing outside my kitchen window, screaming about marble imports and the unbelievable speed of the construction. It's going to be the most exclusive address in the state. Mark, I heard her gush one afternoon. The centerpiece that clubhouse sits going to redefine luxury. Our future is set. I watched them from my living room armchair, where I had spread out the blueprints Silas had secretly provided. The original schematics of Feedline 3. The line ran precisely $6.50 feet beneath. The exact center of the plan, $10. $1 million grand ballroom of the Vance Legacy Estates clubhouse. A crucial access valve was located directly under what the blueprint called the Infinity Edge pool deck. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just building a house. They were constructing a monument to their own greed, completely oblivious that its entire weight rested on my contractual permission. I spent my evenings in the county archives, wearing large, thick glasses and blending in with the history students. I wasn't looking for the easement. Silas already confirmed that. I was looking for the paper trail that confirmed Mark's financial leverage. Found it in the public records, a colossal construction loan, contingent upon the completion of the clubhouse foundation by a specific date. Exactly 45 days from the date I signed the quitclaim deed. Mark had tied his entire financial existence to this one property, using the land's inflated potential value as collateral. If the foundation was delayed, the loan was subject to a massive penalty. If the clubhouse couldn't be built as planned, the loan was in default, and the bank would seize the property. They had been so sure that the 2-acre swamp was worthless. They hadn't bothered with basic due diligence. The greed blinded them. The image of the poor old ant gave them a sense of invincibility. I finalized my plan. It wasn't about fines or lawsuits. It was about foreclosure. It was about taking the entire masterpiece they built with stolen money and having the bank hand it over to the rightful owner. But first, the grand spectacle. The opening night, the night of the grand opening gala, was everything Chloe had envisioned: ostentatious, loud, and utterly self-congratulatory. They had pushed the timeline, throwing the party to secure final investor commitments, even though the foundation was still just a massive pit covered by a temporary, expensive deck and a giant white tent. The party was held under that massive tent, shimmering with imported lights. I could hear the jazz band from my porch, a discordant sound against the quiet of the fields. I put on my best dress, a simple black silk number that hadn't seen daylight in 10 years, and pinned. My grandmother's antique diamond brooch to the lapel. I didn't need to sneak in. Mark had sent me a pity invitation. A printed card with the message, "Come see what your legacy has inspired." I walked across the lawn to the massive tent. The valet attendant, a young boy with a shocked expression, tried to stop me. But I simply smiled and kept walking, the diamond brooch catching the light. Inside, the air was thick with champagne and the clatter of silver. Chloe was the star, draped in a gown that must have cost more than my annuity, holding court with a group of nervous-looking potential investors. Mark, radiating confidence, was shaking hands and gesturing wildly toward the construction site. I watched, unnoticed from the corner, blending into the tapestry of the old money guests who recognized my name but didn't know the drama. I had done what I came to do. I had slipped my small, heavy, pre-approved envelope into the hands of the head contractor, a man who, thanks to a healthy consulting fee, was now loyal to me. The envelope contained two things. A. Legal notice of immediate maintenance and repair for the master utility easement, citing critical failure detection on feed line 3. A certified stop work order from the city water department, signed by the chief engineer, warning of catastrophic infrastructure damage if construction proceeds. The contractor looked pale. He knew a genuine legal nightmare when he saw one. He immediately began issuing hushed commands into his radio. Pulling the key workers away from the site, Mark, oblivious, raised his glass. "To the Vance Legacy Estates," he roared, drawing all attention to himself. "To the future of this city built on Vision Drive." And the sheer audacity to turn a worthless piece of ground into a masterpiece. Chloe cooed, looking directly at the corner where I stood. "And to our beloved Aunt Evelyn, whose small symbolic contribution made this all possible." They lifted their glasses. I lifted mine, a glass of water I had quietly requisitioned. "To the Vision," I murmured, and took a drink. It was exactly 9 p.m. Suddenly, the music died. The spotlights blinked off, plunging the tent into a jarring, nervous semi-darkness broken only by the dim emergency lights. A low, guttural groan, the sound of a major system failing, echoed from beneath the temporary decking. The jazz band stopped. The murmuring crowd went instantly silent. "Generator?" Hiccup. "Nothing to worry about," Mark yelled, forcing a laugh that sounded thin and panicked. He clapped his hands too loudly. "The champagne is still flowing, ladies and gentlemen." But the champagne was not flowing. The bar staff began muttering. Chloe rushed to the kitchen entrance, her face tight with impatience. A moment later, waiter burst out of the kitchen, his white apron soaked. "Mr. St. James." The kitchen. "The water is gone. And the sewage. The drain just backed up. It's flooding the service area." The words sewage and flooding in a $10 million dollar luxury pitch are like a fire alarm at a wedding. The nervous murmurs returned, this time fueled by genuine alarm. "It's a burst pipe," Mark hissed, grabbing Chloe's arm. "An old city line. We were warned about the plumbing here." "No, sir." The head contractor, the one I paid, walked up to Mark. His face was a mask of professional dread. "It's worse. The city water department just issued an emergency stop work order. It cites a critical maintenance failure on feed line 3, the main water source for this entire block. They are shutting down all pressure to prevent catastrophic rupture." He handed Mark my carefully prepared envelope. Mark's fingers fumbled with the thick paper. He pulled out the documents, his eyes darting frantically across the legalese. When he saw the signature, the chief engineer, a name he recognized, and the reference to the master utility easement, his breath hitched. This is insane," he whispered, his face turning an unhealthy shade of mottled gray. "It's impossible. We own this land. We have clear title." Chloe, realizing the gravity of the situation, tore the document from his hand. Her eyes, usually sparkling with predatory ambition, were now wide with genuine fear. "The easement holder? Who is the easement holder, Mark?" Mark was speechless, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom line of the document. "The easement was held under a trust. an old, obscure holding structure that Arthur had set up decades ago. The beneficiary of the trust was unequivocally Evelyn Vance. The music was still off. The air was heavy with the smell of spilled champagne and raw sewage rising from the service areas. The power outage had only been a prelude. The genuine catastrophe was the water. No water, no working restrooms, no fire suppression, and a colossal legal injunction that just halted his entire project. Mark looked up, scanning the faces of the investors who were now gathering their coats, fleeing the disaster. His eyes landed directly on me. I stood there, still in the dark corner, holding my empty glass of water. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The knowledge of my power radiated from me like heat. The crowd evaporated faster than fog in the sun. The sound of high-end cars peeling out of the parking lot was the soundtrack to Mark and Chloe's complete ruin. Within 10 minutes, the massive tent was empty, save for the two of them standing in the dim light. Surrounded by tables of half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and the spreading stain from the service area, Mark lunged at me, his polished facade finally shattering. "You," he screamed, his voice hoarse with failure and terror. "You did this. You crazy old witch. You ruined me. I paid you. I gave you a gift." He grabbed my arm, his grip hard and desperate. I didn't flinch. I looked at the man who was once my sweet, ambitious nephew. Now he was just a thief caught in the act. "You gave me $10,000 for a lie, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the low tone commanding his full attention. "You claimed the land was worthless swamp. You knew it was the cornerstone of your $100 million development. And you tried to move me out in 2 weeks to bury your construction right over my husband's legacy." Chloe rushed forward, trying a different tactic, the crocodile tears. "Aunt Evelyn, please. You don't understand. We're ruined. That loan is due. The bank will take everything." Mark was only protecting his family. I gently pulled my arm free from Mark's grasp. "Protecting his family? You tried to protect your future by destroying mine. You stripped me of my home, my comfort, my peace, all to build a ballroom over a main city waterline." I pulled a small, worn photograph from my purse. It was a picture of a young Arthur Vance, smiling, standing next to a massive iron pipe being lowered into a ditch. "That pipe," I said, my voice heavy with memory, "was the first major project Arthur and I did together. It paid for this ranch. It gave us our start. And when the city wanted to run the line, Arthur insisted on this easement not for money, but for control. He knew that in a world driven by greed, the one who controls the water controls the power. He made sure that if anyone ever built something that threatened the system, the Vances had the right to tear it down." Chloe gasped, staring at the photo, finally understanding the depth of the legal hole they had dug. "The 2 acres you purchased are yours, Mark," I conceded, nodding toward the ruined site. "But the 7 feet of ground directly under your new clubhouse, running from the road to the river, is mine. The easement grants me the right to excavate, repair, and maintain the line at my discretion. And until that maintenance is complete," I concluded, looking him straight in the eye, "the foundation for your clubhouse cannot be poured. The loan is in default, and your entire project is worthless." Mark collapsed onto a linen-covered table, burying his face in his hands. The sound of his defeated sobbing was the most satisfying music I had heard all night. Chloe was frozen, staring at the dark, spreading stain on the expensive decking. "We just need a temporary waiver," Chloe finally pleaded, her voice a strained whisper. "Just until the loan clears. We'll reroute the pipe ourselves. We swear. We'll pay you 10 times what we paid for the land." I shook my head, my face unyielding. "The time for negotiations ended the minute you tried to evict me with 2 weeks' notice." I pulled out a third, smaller document, a bank statement. "The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Mark, the breach of contract regarding the building timeline is insurmountable." "Wait." Mark looked up, tears streaking the grime on his face. "The collateral. The bank will take our house, our cars. Everything we own is tied up in that loan." Perhaps, I said softly, you should have been satisfied with the house, the cars, and everything you already had. Instead of stealing the last dollar from the woman who paid for your college education, I gave them one final piece of information, the last twist of the knife. I placed the final document on a clean part of the table. I contacted the bank yesterday. They are looking for a buyer who can assume the debt and successfully complete the project without violating the easement. I have offered them a structured buyout package. Chloe picked up the paper, her hands shaking violently. It was a formal acquisition offer from Vance Property Holdings, LLC. You are buying your own land back, she stammered. And yours, too, it seems. I corrected. I will buy the debt, foreclose on Mark's holding company, and take ownership of the entire $100 million development uncompleted, unserviceable and worthless to everyone but me. I reached into my purse and pulled out the crisp, uncashed $10,000 check Mark had given me for the quitclaim deed. I tore it once, neatly, and dropped the two pieces onto the table. I don't require your symbolic gifts. I prefer to deal in final ownership. I turned and walked out of the ruined party tent. The air outside was cool and clean. I left Mark and Chloe standing in the dark, staring at the pieces of the torn check, utterly and irrevocably broken by the power of a document they were too greedy to find. My life wasn't over. It had just been reclaimed. The next day I had the power, the land, and the freedom. And all it took was signing the right piece of paper and knowing precisely where to. Turn off the water, the silence after the storm of confrontation is often the most dangerous. I stood on the periphery of what had been my home. The two torn pieces of the $10,000 check still lying on the ruined banquet table. And I felt a chilling sense of quiet focus. Mark and Chloe were gone, consumed by the reality that their greed had not just bankrupted them, but had handed their entire future directly back to me. They were now merely tenants on a property I was about to seize. But before the final paperwork could be filed, before the legal machinery could grind their dreams into dust, I had to confront the physical reality of their crime. I had to see exactly what they had dared to build on the land that held my deepest memories. The moment the sun rose, I walked past the broken champagne flutes and the discarded catering trays. I walked onto the construction site that was formerly the sprawling, rolling acreage of the Vance Ranch. Mark and Chloe hadn't just built houses. They had constructed a narrative. And the narrative was one of pure, unadulterated vanity. The first thing I saw was the gate. It wasn't wood or iron or stone. It was a massive arch of blackened, wrought steel topped by an intricately carved wooden plaque. The plaque didn't say Vance Legacy. It said the Vance Heritage Sanctuary. Sanctuary. The word tasted like ash. It implied exclusivity, refuge, and separation, the exact opposite of the open, giving spirit of the ranch my husband and I had built. They had sealed off my family's history and repackaged it as a luxury amenity. Beyond the gate, where the old welcoming dirt road used to curve gently past the main pastures, Mark had laid down a 4-lane paved boulevard lined with imported Italian cypress trees. The trees were expensive, meticulously manicured, and completely out of place in the rugged, humid climate of the region. They looked fragile, like guests who were too elegant to stay. The whole place radiated a kind of aggressive, hollow perfection. Mark hadn't wanted a neighborhood. He wanted a gilded cage. He wanted a statement that screamed, "We are better than everyone else, including the people we pushed aside to build this." And that was the heart of the mockery. They didn't just replace my ranch. They replaced my values. I walked toward the site of the main house. Arthur and I had lived in a practical, sprawling farmhouse, sturdy, functional, built for raising children and livestock. Mark had demolished that completely. In its place stood what he called the executive residence, a grotesque monument to excess. It was a sprawling white structure of glass and stucco, looking less like a home and more like a minimalist corporate headquarters. It had sharp angles, towering, unused balconies, and a massive 3-story window facing the rota window meant not for admiring the view, but for displaying their wealth to the world. I remember overhearing Chloe, once describing the house to a friend. "It's so much more than a house, darling. It's a statement of intent. We designed it to make you feel slightly intimidated when you pull into the driveway." She achieved her intent. It wasn't the kind of house that invited you in for coffee. It was the kind of building that demanded an appointment and a financial statement. It was cold, hostile, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had been the soul of the Vance land. They had stripped the soil, poisoned the local flora with foreign imports, and replaced the simple beauty of utility with the ostentatious ugliness of extravagance. They had taken a piece of honest American farming history and turned it into a trophy for shallow success. I continued my slow, deliberate tours, gathering evidence not for the court, but for my own emotional accounting. Every feature they installed was a deliberate insult to the memory of my husband and the life we had built. In the back, where Arthur's prize bull, Samson, used to graze, stood a massive, glittering structure they called the Equestrian Center and Day Spa. Featured imported Brazilian hardwood stables for horses they didn't own, and a glass-enclosed infinity pool that was currently half filled with murky construction water. I remembered Mark, when he was just a boy spending hours in the old barn, mucking stalls, learning the value of hard, repetitive labor. He often complained, but Arthur insisted. "The animals rely on you, Mark. That's responsibility. That's the Vance way." Now, the Equestrian Center was not about labor or responsibility. It was about leisure and show. It was built for the kind of people who hire staff to groom their horses and deliver expensive cocktails by the pool. The spirit of the place was entirely reversed, where we taught humility. They celebrated entitlement. And then there was the clubhouse foundation, the massive waterlogged pit where the grand opening gala had occurred. This was the centerpiece of their arrogance. This was the $10 million ballroom that was now directly above my $80-year-old pipe. I stood on the edge of the pit, looking down at the exposed soil. Mark had hired the best engineers, but they couldn't see what I could. A massive, irreversible flaw in their foundation. A flaw rooted not in geology, but in a decades-old contract. I could still hear Mark's voice from the night before. Desperate screams. "We're ruined. The bank will take everything." That statement was the ultimate proof of their hollowness. The first time Arthur faced ruin, he didn't scream at the bank. He worked harder. He innovated. He laid pipe in the sweltering heat. Mark, when faced with the first real obstacle that couldn't be solved by throwing money or deceit at it, immediately collapsed. His masterpiece was built on the shaky foundation of his own fragile ego. The mockery, I realized, was not just in the extravagance, but in the speed of the construction. They had rushed it, pushing contractors, cutting corners, all to meet that critical loan deadline. The rush was driven by pure exhilarating greed. They wanted to monetize their betrayal before I could even fully register what I had lost, but their haste was my greatest advantage. They were so focused on the finish line that they forgot the starting point. They forgot the person they signed the check to. They forgot that legacy is not measured in square footage or imported marble. It is measured in the depth of control and the unyielding stability of the foundation. As I walked away, heading back toward the quiet, humble safety of my own small, surviving cottage, the single structure they couldn't touch without triggering the final legal collapse, I felt a different kind of anger. It wasn't hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, surgical determination. They had built a mockery of the Vance name. Now I would use the true strength of the Vance legacy, the wisdom, the quiet authority, and the control Arthur had so carefully secured to dismantle their creation, piece by arrogant piece. The sight of their massive, desolate sanctuary was the last emotional hurdle. I had seen the insult, I had filed the emotional accounting, and now I was ready for the next, inevitable step, securing the final legal documents that would turn my control over the water into their financial ruin. The mockery was complete. Now the lesson was about to begin. The time for observation was over. The time for the forgotten blueprint was at hand. The wreckage of their vanity was physical. But my victory had to be documented, unassailable, and rooted in the ironclad authority of history. Mark and Chloe had relied on new contracts, leveraging millions built on speculation and current market trends. I would rely on a document older than they were, a piece of paper so deep in the archives that its power had become invisible. I needed the forgotten blueprint after touring the desecrated land. The urgency was no longer just about vengeance. It was about protecting the core asset, the master utility easement, from any last-ditch legal maneuver Mark might attempt. His team would soon discover the existence of the easement, booked, but they would only see the modern generic version filed in the late 80s. They wouldn't see the original, the one that held the true. Devastating Power. Silas, the retired plumber, had hinted at its existence, describing it as Arthur's secret handshake with the city. It wasn't a modern deed. It was a contract of necessity, signed shortly after the Second World War when the city was desperate to modernize its industrial capacity. The courthouse archives, known locally as the Vault, felt like stepping into a cold, quiet mausoleum of bureaucracy. It was a place designed to deter, where the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and institutional neglect. I presented my request to the young clerk, a man who looked barely old enough to vote, much less understand the history of civil engineering in the region. I need records pertaining to the 1945 City Works Agreement regarding the Central Feed Line 3. I requested calmly. The clerk blinked, frowning at his glowing computer screen. Ma'am, anything pre-75 is microfiche only. We digitized all active property liens and rights-of-way. If it's not in the system, it's irrelevant. I assure you, I replied, leaning across the counter, giving him the full weight of my most serious matriarch stare. It is far from irrelevant. It is the original grant of right-of-way, before the state began standardizing the easement language. I need the box labeled CWD 1940 to 1950. Agreements. Undocumented. He sighed, clearly annoyed at the interruption to his digital world. But the authority in my voice won out. After a lengthy, noisy retrieval process involving a rickety cart and an ancient elevator, he returned with a dusty, leather-bound book and a massive archival box. The next 5 hours were a painstaking journey through municipal history. I ignored the book, focusing on the contents of the heavy box. Inside were brittle, yellowed maps, handwritten meeting minutes from the 1940s, and receipts for materials that no longer existed. And then I found it. It wasn't a deed. It was a trifold document bound by a rusty clip, labeled simply Agreement Re Water Supply, Infrastructure, and Land Covenant. Sec. For the paper was thick, almost like cardstock, and smelled faintly of tobacco and coal dust. The ink was faded, but the language was perfectly clear, written in the verbose, meticulous style of post-war civic lawyers. I found the crucial clause, highlighted decades ago with a red pencil mark, Arthur's mark. It was the original maintenance covenant. The modern easement, Mark's lawyers might have found, contained generic language about reasonable access for maintenance. But the 1945 covenant, written when the city was desperate for the line to go through anywhere, contained truly spectacular language. It granted the landowner, Arthur Vance, and his designated heirs a non-exclusive, perpetual, unrestricted right of maintenance, inspection, and unilateral emergency access to the line. Unrestricted, unilateral emergency. This was the power Mark's legal team could never have anticipated. The modern easement was passive, subject to court intervention and negotiation. The 1945 covenant was active and executive. It gave the easement holder, me, the power of a city engineer, with the legal standing of a private property owner. But the true genius of Arthur's foresight was in the penalty clause, the part that turned my simple right of maintenance into Mark's complete ruin. The covenant stated, in precise, unforgiving language, that any construction that impinges upon, obstructs, or places undue burden upon the structural integrity or maintenance pathway of the feed line would automatically trigger a default, making the infringing structure subject to immediate, mandatory, and compensatory removal by the covenant holder. Furthermore, the damages were stipulated not as simple financial reimbursement, but as the assumption of all accrued project debt by the infringing party, nullifying the initial land sale and reverting title to the covenant holder at the initial purchase price. Mark had paid me $10,000 for the land. I was about to use that $10,000 purchase price to take ownership of his entire $100 million development. Arthur had built a failsafe into the very foundation of the land. He hadn't just protected the pipe. He had protected the family legacy from future greed, even the greed of his own descendants. He knew that the ultimate security was not in money, but in leverage. I carefully copied the covenant. I photographed the page. I didn't dare remove the original, knowing the fragility of the paper and the weight of the moment. I just needed the precise language to give to my attorney. I closed the box, returned the ancient materials to the indifferent clerk, and walked out into the bright sunshine of the modern world, holding in my memory the true power of the past. The modern contracts, the bank loans, the massive mortgages, they were all built on the assumption of clear title and predictable legal precedent. But Mark's foundation rested on a technicality from 1945. A clause written by a shrewd man who valued control over short-term profit. I had the forgotten blueprint. Now it was time to deploy it and initiate the next stage of the plan. To use my legal authority to literally turn off the lifeblood of their doomed enterprise. The power I held wasn't just on paper. It was in the pipes. I walked to the nearest phone booth, a quaint, deliberate gesture, and dialed my attorney. The calm in my voice was absolute. The time for sentiment was over. The time for the master switch had arrived. The silence that followed the water shutdown was the sound of utter, overwhelming failure. In the vacuum created by the sudden collapse of utilities, panic wasn't just creeping in. It was sprinting. The massive executive residence, with its glass walls and ostentatious balconies, was now merely a giant, expensive kill, uninhabitable without climate control and functioning water systems. It was a monument to hubris, utterly dependent on the very infrastructure Mark had tried to bury. I knew that Mark and Chloe were locked inside. Not arguing about my betrayal, but arguing about their lawyers. The loss of water was more than an inconvenience. It was a breach of the loan covenant. I didn't wait for the lawyers to call. I waited for the desperation to peak. Mark's arrogance meant he had scheduled the grand opening prematurely. Less than 2 weeks after I signed the deed. He needed the investor commitments to prove solvency and keep the bank from sniffing too closely at his timeline. This premature celebration was the perfect stage for the final act of my counterdash move. My invitation had arrived the week before, a gilded, heavy card urging me to attend the inaugural Vance Heritage Sanctuary Gala, a celebration of Mark's vision and the generous spirit of the Vance family. I set the date and time on my calendar. Like any ordinary social engagement, this was not about revenge. This was about attending the official liquidation ceremony of my nephew's future on the night of the gala. The chaos was palpable even from my cottage. Expensive cars, Ferraris, Aston Martins, Mercedes were already clogging the temporary unpaved service roads. The air was heavy with the smell of rich cologne and the frantic energy of high-stakes networking. I dressed simply. No high-end labels, no dazzling jewels, only the severe, quiet dignity that comes from knowing you hold every single card. I wore a charcoal gray suit, a color of finality, and my small, practical silver wristwatch. This was a business meeting, not a party. The moment I arrived at the sanctuary gate, the young valet, flustered by the sheer volume of wealth, tried to direct me to the staff entrance. "I am Evelyn Vance," I stated, my voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "I am a named honoree. Please direct me to—" "The main tent?" The valet, recognizing the name from the hideous wooden sign and instinctively recognizing true authority, immediately directed me through the main entrance. The scene inside the enormous, temporary marquee tent was a grotesque tableau of forced success. Mark and Chloe, radiant and utterly fake, stood under blinding spotlights, greeting investors whose smiles looked thin and conditional. Chloe was wearing an emerald dress that shimmered like liquid greed. Mark was in a white tuxedo, sweating lightly under the intense pressure of performance. They hadn't installed the final plumbing, but they had paid handsomely for temporary chemical toilets and enormous chillers to mask the lack of proper utilities. I watched from the periphery, declining the offered champagne. I was drinking the rich, savory taste of anticipation. Mark was holding court on a small stage, using a microphone that echoed slightly, giving his voice a false boom. "Welcome," he bellowed. "Welcome to the inauguration of the Vance Heritage Sanctuary. We are not just building homes. We are building an entire lifestyle rooted in the legacy of the Vance family. This project is a testament to the fact that with vision and capital, you can turn anything, even a challenging piece of land, into a masterpiece." He looked directly toward where I stood, offering a strained plastic smile. "And I want to offer a profound thank you to my dear Aunt Evelyn Vance for her initial generous support, which provided the spiritual foundation for this whole enterprise." The crowd offered a polite, muted round of applause. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. This was my moment to deploy the second phase of the plan, the humiliation. The legal damage was done, but the financial wreckage needed to be witnessed by the very people Mark was trying to impress. I subtly moved toward the massive, multi-tiered ice sculpture that dominated the center of the room. It was a frozen replica of the executive residence, a temporary, unnecessary extravagance. I caught the eye of the head of catering, a woman named Teresa, whom I had known from the local community for 30 years. Teresa, unlike Mark's imported staff, knew the value of a steady water supply. I had slipped her a small, discreet message earlier in the day. "Critical utility failure imminent. Be ready for rapid extraction." I reached the podium just as Mark was about to launch into the financials. The room was hot. The temporary chillers were struggling against the local climate and the body heat of 100 people. Suddenly, a loud, sustained clatter echoed from the kitchen area. It was the sound of metal racks collapsing, followed by shouting. Mark faltered, his eyes darting toward the noise. "Just a minor catering issue," he hissed into the microphone, trying to sound authoritative. "Nothing to worry about." But the noise intensified. Teresa, the caterer, appeared at the service door, her face pale, and she spoke in a voice sharp with genuine panic. "Mr. St. James, we have a crisis," she yelled, ignoring the microphone. "The temporary chiller unit just failed. The pipes are overheating and the condensation is flooding the temporary kitchen. We cannot service the food." A loud hissing sound filled the tent, followed by a thick, acrid cloud of steam that poured out of the service entrance. The combination of heat, the sudden failure of the cooling system, and the panicked announcement instantly shattered the illusion of success. The investors began murmuring loudly. They were not concerned about the food. They were concerned about system failure. In high-end real estate, system failure is a sign of underlying financial instability. Mark's face was a mask of sheer, pure terror. He saw his control dissolving in the steam pouring from the kitchen. Chloe rushed to the kitchen door, shouting at the caterer in a desperate, high-pitched shriek. Her veneer of sophistication melted instantly, exposing the crude entitlement beneath. "You idiot. Just put the food out. Why are you making a scene?" Teresa, the caterer, simply shook her head, holding up a burned hand wrapped in a towel. "Ma'am, the temporary system is completely useless without the proper water pressure. It's a risk of fire now." Fire risk? That phrase hit the investors like a physical blow. Insurance liability, safety. They began gathering their portfolios and jackets, their thin smiles replaced by the hard, suspicious glares of capital protecting itself. Mark, seeing his audience fleeing, looked like a man drowning. He abandoned the stage and rushed toward the investors, trying to grab their arms, trying to plead. "It's temporary. Just a small glitch. We have guarantees. The foundation is solid. The foundation is a muddy pit that the city water department has condemned." One investor, a stern-looking woman in a severe black suit stated coldly. She looked directly at Mark, then at the sputtering chiller unit. No water, no cooling, no fire suppression. You have fundamental utility failure, Mr. St. James. I think we'll wait for the next quarterly report. She walked past Mark and headed for the exit. The others followed in a quick, devastating wave of abandonment. Mark's screams of pleading and denial were swallowed by the noise of retreating engines. His grand opening had become a catastrophic, very public evacuation. I stood there until the last of the expensive cars had vanished down the Cypress Line Drive. Mark and Chloe were left alone in the wreckage of the tent. The lights dimmed, the air conditioner groaning in its final death throes. Chloe was crying hysterically, her emerald dress suddenly looking cheap and theatrical. Mark was leaning against the collapsed podium, his white tuxedo smeared with sweat and the grime from the failing system. He finally looked at me, still standing by the entrance. His eyes were not angry anymore. They were empty, recognizing the author of his doom. "You," he whispered, the sound raw and broken. "You did this. The water. You stopped the water. I exercised my legal right to protect the public infrastructure from your dangerous construction," I replied, walking slowly toward the center of the silent, ruined tent. My steps echoed on the temporary deck. "You invited me here, Mark. You wanted me to see your masterpiece, and I saw it. I saw how you turned your grandmother's land into a symbol of transient, self-serving luxury built on a lie." I stopped at the edge of the pit, looking down into the massive, empty hole where the clubhouse foundation was supposed to be. "The lie failed, Mark," I concluded, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute finality. "And now the bank has seen it too. They saw the public failure, the fire risk, and the utility collapse. They saw their collateral vanish in a cloud of steam. The grand opening disaster was complete. Mark had given me the stage, and I had used it to deliver the most devastating financial blow possible. The scene was now set for the final, inescapable moment of truth, the one desperate call they would make, seeking a legal fix that didn't exist. The call to the expert who had already pledged loyalty to the master switch. The night of the gala was the turning point. But victory in the theater of humiliation means nothing without total dominance in the courtroom of finance. Mark and Chloe were now emotionally shattered. But their desperate minds would immediately turn to the one thing they trusted: expertise. They needed an engineer. They needed a lawyer. They needed a man with enough authority to declare my emergency maintenance order invalid, fraudulent, or at least negotiable. They would believe that a technical expert, a high-priced consultant, could simply override the crazy old woman and her ancient contracts. I was ready for that call. I was waiting for the moment they would choose the most aggressive, most expensive, most highly regarded figure in local infrastructure consulting, and they chose Dr. Malcolm Rivers. Dr. Rivers was a legend, a man in his late 60s. Impeccably dressed, a former dean of civil engineering at the State University, and now the principal of a highly sought-after utility consulting firm. He charged an exorbitant retainer, and his specialty was identifying flaws in city contracts to benefit large-scale private developments. He was exactly the kind of arrogant firepower Mark would think could save him. The phone rang late the next morning, shaking the silence of my quiet cottage. It was Solomon, my attorney. "Evelyn," his voice was crisp with controlled excitement. "They've hired Rivers. He's demanding all of our documentation, citing intentional delay and economic terrorism. He wants an emergency meeting immediately to discuss compensation and the rerouting of the line." "Rivers is good, Solomon, but he is predictable," I replied, carefully pouring myself a cup of tea. "He sees a problem that can be solved with money. He does not see a problem rooted in morality or history. He believes he can invalidate the 1945 covenant." "He hasn't seen the original yet," I corrected. "He's relying on the modern interpretation. He thinks Arthur simply had a right-of-way, not a private franchise." This was the beautiful final trap. Rivers would assume he was coming to fight me, Instead, he would be walking directly into a decades-old web of personal, professional, and ethical obligation. The key to understanding Dr. Rivers wasn't his resume. It was his history. I knew the man intimately, not through business, but through my husband. Arthur Vance was not just a rancher. He was an innovative, self-taught engineer. Back when Rivers was a struggling graduate student, it was Arthur who gave him his first real-world opportunity. An internship designing the initial industrial expansion plans that relied on the newly laid PI Line 3. Arthur mentored Rivers. He funded his final years of school. He instilled in him the core engineering ethics that the welfare of the public. Infrastructure always superseded private profit. He built his career. He shaped his soul. I picked up the phone and made a single, private call to Rivers's personal unlisted number, bypassing the screaming and panicked calls from Mark's firm. "Malcolm," I said the moment he answered, my voice steady, carrying the weight of both authority and memory. "This is Evelyn Vance. We need to talk about Arthur's legacy." Silence hung on the line, a profound, heavy silence that stretched across 40 years of history. "Evelyn," he finally said, the arrogance instantly stripped from his voice. "I was just retained by Mark. He says you're being unreasonable, that you're using an old easement as leverage." "Mark says a great many things that are untrue, Malcolm," I countered, keeping my tone gentle but absolute. "He told me he bought a swamp for $10,000, then tried to build a $100 million clubhouse over the pipe that feeds the entire north side of this city." I didn't need to argue the legal points. I spoke only to the ethical foundation Arthur had built inside him. "I am not being unreasonable, Malcolm. I am being the custodian of the covenant." Arthur protected that line for the public. And Mark's construction represents a critical existential threat to the city's infrastructure. You know this is true. You helped draw those initial pressure maps. Dr. Rivers hesitated. The price of his retainer from Mark was battling the price of his soul. "Evelyn, what do you want? I can negotiate a reroute. Mark will pay anything to save his project now. But I don't want money, Malcolm. I want the truth, certified by the most respected engineer in the state," I corrected. "I want you to come here, inspect the site, review the original 1945 covenant, and give an honest, professional judgment on the structural integrity of the feed line. Given the vibration and stress from Mark's failed excavation," I added the final critical piece of leverage, "Mark is demanding you invalidate my emergency order. I am asking you to certify that my emergency order was necessary and proper to prevent a catastrophic public health crisis." The silence returned. Longer this time. He knew that certifying my actions as necessary meant destroying his client, but it meant upholding the entire ethical code Arthur had instilled in him. "Be there in an hour." "Evelyn," he said, his voice now flat, professional, and deeply serious, "but only if I can see the original 1945 document. I need to understand what Arthur truly created." I knew he would come. He wasn't just coming for a legal review. He was coming for a pilgrimage to the core of his engineering ethics. When Dr. Rivers arrived, he didn't drive the usual flashy car of a high-end consultant. He drove a modest, slightly worn SUV, a sign that he was leaving the consultant behind and bringing the engineer to the site. He was pale, visibly shaken by the prospect of confronting his mentor's widow and the financial ruin of a development he had initially admired from afar. We didn't meet in my cottage. We met at the edge of the clubhouse, Pit the Muddy, desolate hole where Mark's $10 million dream lay dying. I handed him a pristine photocopy of the 1945 covenant, and he spent the next 45 minutes walking the perimeter of the site, taking readings, examining the soil stress, and, most importantly, rereading the document. Mark and Chloe remained hidden in the executive residence, watching us from behind the curtained windows, too ashamed and too terrified to come out and face the man they had hired. They believed Dr. Rivers was their last hope, their $200,000 Hail Mary pass to save their development. Dr. Rivers finally returned to me, the thick copy of the covenant clutched in his hand. His face was a study in professional resignation. "Evelyn," he began, his voice barely audible over the light wind. "Mark's construction method created massive stress points exactly where the 1945 plans indicate the line is oldest. If you had not initiated the emergency shutdown, there was a 50% chance of a serious rupture within the next 30 days. He continued, his eyes meeting mine. Your action was not malicious interference, Evelyn. It was necessary and proper. You averted a public health disaster. Your husband's covenant is absolute. The construction is in violation of Section 4 and must be removed entirely to facilitate inspection and repair. The verdict was in, certified, undeniable, and delivered by their own high-priced expert. And Mark's legal position, Malcolm? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, looking disgusted. He has none. The 1945 covenant supersedes all subsequent city permits and property sales. His title is not clear. He built on an active, controlled utility access point. His bank loan is now in total default, and the collateral is worthless until your repair work is completed, which, as the covenant holder, you have the right to protract indefinitely. Dr. Rivers walked toward the massive glass window of the executive residence, where the terrified faces of Mark and Chloe were pressed against the glass. He didn't wave or make eye contact. He simply pulled out his notepad, wrote a quick, sharp note, and gave it to the single remaining security guard. The note was his official report. It certified that the emergency maintenance order was justified and that the construction represented an immediate threat to public safety. It effectively destroyed any legal defense Mark had left. As Dr. Rivers drove away, its duty to Arthur fulfilled, I walked back toward my cottage. But before I reached the door, saw a new sight. Mark and Chloe were finally emerging from the executive residence. They walked slowly, hesitantly, defeated, their designer clothes looking ridiculous against the mud and the ruined construction site. They approached my fence, and their faces, now stripped of arrogance, wealth, and deceit, were simply the faces of two people who had gambled their whole lives and lost everything. "Aunt Evelyn," Mark choked out, his voice a pathetic plea. "Please, we'll give you everything. We'll deed the house back to you. Just turn on the water. We need to save the loan. The bank is going to take everything." "You already gave me everything, Mark," I replied, standing behind the wire fence, the barrier representing the legal chasm between us. "You gave me the perfect legal opportunity to exercise my rights, and I took it." The emergency call had been made, and the expert they trusted had sealed their fate, confirming that the master switch was not an act of vengeance, but an act of necessary justice. The time for pleading was over. The time for the final humiliating confrontation on the land they stole had arrived. The world of high finance operates on the illusion of stability, but that night the illusion was set to crumble, not with an explosion, but with the simple, devastating flick of a switch. Mark and Chloe's gala was not just a celebration. It was a desperate final attempt to charm investors into ignoring the deep rot in their foundation. The entire performance, the expensive lights, the imported food, the shimmering ice sculpture, built on a temporary power grid and an assumption of continuous service. I was ready for the moment their assumed control would be exposed as fraudulent. I was ready for the blackout. The scene inside the marquee tent was one of aggressive, forced joy. Mark, in his stiff white tuxedo, looked like a puppet straining against his strings, overly loud and intensely focused on selling the fantasy of the Vance Heritage Sanctuary. Chloe, beside him, glittered but rarely smiled, her eyes constantly scanning the room for signs of doubt. My presence was a quiet anchor in the corner, a dark silhouette observing the frantic energy. I was the witness, the judge, and the executor. The precise moment for the blackout was not random. It had to coincide with the climax of their sales pitch, when the maximum number of high-value investors were present, their checkbooks theoretically open, Mark had just launched into the most crucial segment of his speech. The segment detailing the exclusive amenities that justified the astronomical prices. He was describing the future clubhouse, the very structure whose foundation was now condemned. Double quotes, ... Imagine the elegance. He was booming, gesturing toward the blueprints displayed on a massive video screen of the 3-story ballroom, the zero-entry infinity pool, and the completely self-sufficient smart home technology. This is not just a community. It is an economic fortress. He took a dramatic pause for effect, waiting for the applause that would cement his perceived authority. The applause never came. Instead, a subtle but profound sound filled the air. A mechanical whine dying. The first thing to go was the ambient music, the soft jazz track that had been smoothing over the nervous chatter. It sputtered once, then vanished, leaving a sudden, awkward silence. Mark frowned, visibly annoyed. He tapped the microphone. Just a minor technical glitch, ladies and gentlemen. As I was saying, but the glitches were just beginning. The massive video screen displaying the dazzling blueprints flickered into a sudden, stark darkness, the lighting a complex network of carefully placed spotlights. Designed to flatter the expensive art, and the investors' faces began to dim. Not all at once, but in an unsettling, segmented cascade. One bank of lights on the east side died, then another on the west, leaving eerie pools of shadow across the dance floor. The emergency lights? Small, harsh halogen bulbs clicked on, bathing the tent in a sterile, pale yellow glow that exposed the temporary nature of the entire setup. The illusion of permanent luxury was instantly stripped away. The investors stopped smiling. They exchanged quick, nervous glances. In the world of high-value property development, a sudden, inexplicable power failure during a major pitch meeting is not a glitch. It is a warning. Mark was now sweating visibly under the pale, unforgiving emergency lights. He grabbed the microphone, his voice sharp with strain. It's a city failure. We are running off supplementary generators, but the main power grid must have experienced a surge. We have backup, I assure you. He was lying. They weren't running off generators yet. They were running off the main electrical feed they had secured from the street, a feed that was supplied by the very utility network whose core integrity I had legally challenged. The true blackout wasn't about the electricity. It was about the systems that the electricity fed. The massive, silent chillers, the heavy equipment brought in to cool the enormous tent, began to fail almost immediately. In the humid southern air, the internal temperature of the tent spiked instantly. The air became thick, heavy, and still. Panic accelerated. Mark's control disintegrated further. A woman near the back of the tent, her face flushed with heat, fanned herself rapidly with a menu. It's suffocating in here. Where is the ventilation? Chloe, who had been trying to maintain her pose of unbothered elegance, abandoned her station and rushed to the service entrance, her heels sinking slightly into the temporary flooring. I saw her hiss frantic instructions into a cell phone, presumably to the maintenance crew. But the maintenance crew could do nothing. The underlying issue was not a fuse or a faulty wire. It was the intentional cessation of critical utility functions required to support such a large temporary demand. The infrastructure, crippled by my emergency maintenance order on feed line 3, could no longer handle the power stress. Mark, recognizing that the party was spiraling into chaos, tried one last desperate move. He signaled a waiter to open a fresh, towering bottle of champagne to distract the crowd. The waiter struggled with the cork, applying significant pressure. And that's when the next, most humiliating failure occurred, as the waiter struggled with the bottle. The pressure required to successfully pop the cork put an undue final stress on the makeshift sanitation system they had cobbled together for the event. A loud, vulgar gurgling noise erupted from the temporary restroom trailer outside, followed by a sudden sickening smell that wafted straight into the elegant marquee. The aroma was undeniable. Sewage. The investors, who had tolerated the dim lights and the rising heat, could not tolerate the violation of basic sanitation. The noise and the smell were the final physical proof that Mark's entire sanctuary was built on a flimsy, failing foundation. It was a full sensory assault on their trust. A prominent hedge fund manager, a man who had been particularly skeptical of Mark's numbers, lowered his glass. His face was a mask of cold displeasure. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice slicing through the chaos, "I believe we have witnessed sufficient evidence regarding the reliability of the site's infrastructure. I will be withdrawing my initial commitment." He walked directly to the exit, grabbing his assistant on the way out. His departure was the catalyst. The other investors, realizing their money was at risk in a failed, unsanitary, and potentially unsafe development, followed suit. They didn't walk. They fled, eager to put distance between themselves and the disaster. Mark and Chloe were left screaming into the humid, dark air, their voices dissolving into the sound of retreating luxury cars. Their meticulously planned high-stakes gala had become a swift, public humiliation. I watched the last red taillight disappear. The tent was abandoned, the ice sculpture melting rapidly under the rising heat. The smell of sewage now mingling with the scent of ruined flowers and stale fear. The silence returned, but this time 'twas the sound of absolute defeat. Mark and Chloe staggered back into the tent, their perfect evening destroyed. Mark ripped off his tie, his shirt clinging to his back. Chloe stood staring at her reflection in a tarnished silver platter, her tears streaking the expensive makeup. "It wasn't a glitch," Mark choked out, grabbing his wife's arm. "It was sabotage. It had to be. Who would benefit from the entire block losing power and water pressure on this exact night?" He was close to the truth, but still too consumed by his own ego to name the perpetrator. He was still looking for a rival developer, a competitor, a massive corporate entity. He still couldn't conceive that the crazy old woman he had fleeced for $10,000 was the one pulling the strings. I walked slowly towards the center of the pit. I picked up a perfectly polished silver spoon that lay discarded on the temporary flooring, held it up to the pale emergency light, and looked at my own reflection. The matriarch's face was stern, calm, and entirely satisfied. The blackout was not just technical. It was a metaphorical switch. It turned off the light of their financial future and exposed the darkness of their ethical choices. They had built their fortress on a temporary lie, and that lie had just been washed away by the failing systems they ignored. The final act of their downfall was now imminent. They had to seek help. They had to call the expert who would tell them the water wasn't coming back on. They had to call the man who was secretly loyal to the master switch and the legacy of Arthur Vance. The blackout was over. The emergency call was coming next. The aftermath of the gala was not characterized by shouting or accusations, but by the hollow, ringing silence of isolation. Mark and Chloe were finally facing the horrifying consequence of their avarice. The world they relied on, the world of high-priced legal talent and compliant municipal bureaucracy, had vanished. Their expensive safety net had failed. They were trapped in the executive residence, which was now less a sanctuary and more a beautifully designed prison. The air conditioning was gone, the toilets were unusable, and the massive glass windows amplified the heat of the morning sun. Their first instinct, I knew, would not be to apologize, but to litigate. Mark's entire adult life was built on the principle that every problem has a price tag, and every legal issue can be buried beneath a mountain of paperwork and billing hours. He reached immediately for his phone, dialing his top corporate lawyer, a man named Sterling, who charged a $1,000 hourly fee for the sheer privilege of hearing his voice. The first call went to voicemail. Sterling, a man who usually answered a multi-million-dollar client's calls at 3 a.m, was suddenly unavailable. Mark tried again. He tried his real estate attorney, the woman who assured him the title was absolutely clear. Voicemail. He tried the firm specializing in contract disputes, the one he promised to use to sue me for malicious interference. The receptionist politely informed him that the firm was undergoing internal review of existing client relationships and could not take his call. Panic, in a man like Mark, doesn't manifest as fear. It manifests as furious impotence. I knew exactly why the phone calls were going unanswered the moment Dr. Malcolm Rivers certified my emergency maintenance order as necessary and proper. The legal landscape shifted from a negotiable financial dispute to a clear-cut contractual default and public safety liability. Solomon, my own quiet, brilliant lawyer, had spent the night ensuring that every prominent corporate law firm in the region received a confidential one-page memo. That memo contained 3 devastating pieces of information: a certified copy of the 1945 Master Utility Covenant. Dr. Rivers's independent certification confirming the construction's threat to the public water supply. A formal notice that any firm attempting to challenge the emergency order would be immediately named as a co-defendant in a massive civil suit for obstruction of public utility maintenance and economic endangerment. The high-end legal world runs not on passion, but on risk assessment. Faced with the choice between a massive, ethically questionable lawsuit against a public utility mandate, backed by a 1945 federal-level contract, and a furious, defaulting client, they dropped Mark instantly. A $1,000 per hour fee isn't worth a $50 million liability. Mark, oblivious to this silent legal blockade, was now rampaging through the executive residence. I watched him from my kitchen window. He was running from room to room, shouting into his phone, his white tuxedo jacket discarded, his hair disheveled. He was a wealthy man suddenly realizing that his money could no longer buy him influence, protection, or even a return phone call. Chloe, meanwhile, was experiencing her own separate breakdown. She wasn't worried about the law. She was worried about status. I saw her collapse onto the plush, Italian imported couch in the living room, trying desperately to reach her social circle. She called her wealthy friends, the wives of the investors who had fled the night before. Seeking sympathy and validation, the responses were uniformly cold. The women had seen the sewage, they had felt the heat, and they had listened to their husbands discuss the imminent loan default. They didn't see Chloe as a victim. They saw her as a liability, a woman whose instability could tarnish their own social reputation. The final, humiliating blow came from a source Chloe least expected: the designer boutique where she bought her gowns. I saw her screaming into the phone by the window. I couldn't hear the words, but the anguish was clear. Later, Solomon confirmed my suspicions. The boutique had called to demand immediate payment for the emerald dress Chloe wore to the gala. Citing the sudden loss of financial guarantee from Mark's holding company, they demanded payment, or they would initiate legal action. The system was eating itself. The same financial structure Mark used to accumulate his wealth, credit, leveraged guarantees. And the illusion of liquidity was now turning inward, consuming him and his wife piece by piece. The lawyers were silent. The friends were silent. The only thing that answered was the cold, hard, inescapable fact of their financial ruin. Mark finally emerged from the house, looking defeated and raw. He staggered across the ruined lawn, Chloe trailing behind him, her face tear-streaked and hopeless. They weren't dressed for a confrontation. They were dressed for a surrender. They walked slowly toward the wire fence separating my humble cottage from their grand, ruined construction site. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They were stripped of all pretense. They knew they couldn't sue me because their own expert had condemned their property. They knew they couldn't negotiate because the bank was now circling like a vulture. Mark gripped the wire fence, his hands trembling. He couldn't afford to call anyone else. His credit cards were likely maxed, his line of credit frozen pending the loan review, and his retainer money was burned. Aunt Evelyn, his voice was rough, barely recognizable. We know. We know you hold the covenant. We know we messed up. We beg you. We are ruined. The bank is going to take the house and everything. Please just tell us the price. Tell us what you want to turn on the water. Chloe, standing beside him, didn't speak, but her desperate eyes pleaded more loudly than Mark's voice. She looked at my cottage, at the simple, functional life I led. And the irony must have been a physical pain. She had mocked my small life, and now she was begging for the stability it represented. "There is no price, Mark," I replied, walking out onto my porch, standing firmly on the honest ground of my cottage. I held a glass of water, cool and clear, a symbol of the control he had lost. "The time for a price was when you offered me $10,000 for my legacy and lied to my face. The time for a price was when you signed documents that put the public water supply at risk. You built your castle on my foundation, Mark," I concluded, the ultimate inescapable truth hanging between us. "Now you must face the consequences of building on an unstable lie." The panic calls had gone unanswered. The experts had abandoned them. The legal machine that created them had now devoured them. The only thing left was the final devastating confrontation. Leading to their utter ruin, the time for phone calls and lawyers was over. The time for the last inescapable truth had arrived. I stood on the porch of my humble cottage, the sun high and bright, providing stark illumination for the raw scene before me. My nephew, Mark, and his wife, Chloe, stood on the far side of the wire fence. The boundary that now felt less like a property line and more like the precipice of their ruin. They were desperate, broken, and finally they were honest. They had nothing left to hide behind. Their expensive suits were wrinkled, their faces were lined with fatigue, and the glittering sheen of their false wealth was gone. Replaced by the dull pallor of fear, Mark gripped the wire fence, the symbol of the separation he had tried to create. "Now his last anchor. Aunt Evelyn," he began, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual bombast. "We need to talk. Not as business people, as family." I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the fence, stopping just short of the boundary, refusing to step onto their ruined, condemned property. "You forfeited the right to claim family when you traded my home for $10,000 and a lie." "Mark," I replied, my voice calm and low, forcing him to strain to hear me. "You didn't ask for help. You engineered a theft. Let us speak honestly now, as a matriarch speaking to those who betrayed her trust." Chloe, seeing the finality in my demeanor, rushed forward, trying the tears one last time. "Evelyn, please. We didn't know the land was worth this. We just wanted a good life. Mark was under so much pressure from his partners. He needed collateral." "Collateral?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "Did you not believe that the life and comfort of your aunt, the woman who raised you, was worth more than a desperate gamble?" I looked past them, toward the desolate pit where the clubhouse was supposed to stand, and the skeletal frame of the executive residence looming silently behind. "You are here because you failed to understand a fundamental principle of this land," I stated. "You thought the value was on the surface, the view, the size, the perceived prestige. You failed to look beneath the dirt." Mark stared at the ground, unable to meet my gaze. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Now the 1945 covenant. We hired Rivers to fix it," he mumbled, his voice thick with defeat. "He told us it was a legal trap, that your husband was brilliant." "Arthur was not brilliant because he made money," I corrected. "Arthur was brilliant because he understood leverage and integrity. He knew that if you control the water, you control the land. He built the master utility easement not as a source of wealth, but as a source of protection for the city and for the family name." I pointed toward the massive, open excavation pit. "You tore up the hallowed ground where your grandfather walked. You planned to build a ballroom over a pipe designed to serve the public. You treated the very earth that sustained this family for generations as nothing more than a foundation for your vanity. Think that," I said, my voice rising slightly, "the authority absolute, is why you failed." Chloe wiped her face, suddenly shifting from weeping to frustrated anger. The entitlement reasserting itself even in ruin. "But it's ours now. The deeds are signed. The bank gave us the loan. You can't just stop the water indefinitely. That's illegal economic interference." I held up a pristine white envelope I had been carrying. It wasn't a threat. It was the final devastating piece of evidence. This is not economic interference, Chloe. This is the legal execution of a default clause. I explained the brutal final reality of their situation. Your loan with the bank contains a clause stipulating that any material, breach of city codes, or failure to maintain essential utilities constitutes an event of default. Dr. Rivers has certified that your construction method violated the integrity of the public water supply. The city water department and the bank have both recognized the validity of the 1945 covenant. Therefore, I concluded, the words falling like the hammer of a gavel, the bank has declared your entire multi-million-dollar loan in default. The collateral, the land, and the partial construction ease now subject to immediate seizure. Mark looked up, his face a horrifying mask of disbelief. Seizure? But we own the house. The executive residence. The residence is a permanent fixture built on the land that is now collateral, I replied, showing no mercy. You own nothing, Mark. The bank owns it all. I leaned in, delivering the final, crushing blow. But I, through Vance Property Holdings, LLC, have made an arrangement with the bank. Under the terms of the 1945 covenant, the default allows the original covenant holder to nullify the land sale and assume the debt at the initial price, provided the holder can guarantee the integrity of the utility line. I paused for the information to sink in. You paid me $10,000 for this land. I am using that same $10,000 plus the cost of the accumulated debt to buy your entire failed project from the bank. By tomorrow afternoon, the deed will revert back to me, and all your corporate debts will be extinguished because I will own the liability. Chloe gasped, a raw, choking sound. You bought our house. You bought the development. You ruined us just to take it back. I didn't ruin you, Chloe. Your greed ruined you, I stated firmly. You tried to take my life savings and my home under false pretenses. I simply used the rules Arthur created to ensure that integrity ultimately wins over avarice. You built your castle on my foundation, I reiterated, my voice ringing with final authority. And when the foundation was threatened, the true owner of that foundation reclaimed the castle. I looked at Mark one last time, seeing the broken boy he had become. You wanted a legacy, Mark? Here is your legacy. The cost of betrayal is the loss of everything. The confrontation was over. There was no rage left in them, only the crushing weight of realization. Mark and Chloe stumbled back, finally turning away from the fence. They walked slowly toward the executive residence, not as owners, but as TRSPASs. They were allowed one final, humiliating afternoon to gather their personal belongings. I didn't watch them. I didn't need to. My victory was complete, documented, and utterly irreversible. I walked back onto my porch, stepping onto the solid, honest foundation of my cottage. I had the land. I had the utility control. And most importantly, I had restored the integrity of the Vance name. The cost was high, the cost of my trust. The pain of the betrayal, but the return was infinite. Absolute freedom, justice, and the restoration of a sacred legacy. The matriarch had protected her own. The final act was approaching, using this reclaimed power not to hold on to the ruin, but to achieve the ultimate liberation. The ultimate price of betrayal is rarely paid in cash. It is paid in absolute submission. Mark and Chloe had made their last plea, and I had delivered the final truth. They were ruined, and I was the owner of their ruin. The law was now on my side, but the physical act of their defeat still needed to be executed. They were still physically present in the executive residence, clinging to the remnants of their stolen fantasy. I had given them no deadline for leaving during the confrontation. I simply stated the fact of the foreclosure. But I knew that true finality required a time limit, a precise moment when their ownership banned, their hope expired. The next morning, I placed a final business-like call to Solomon. The bank has formally accepted the buyout package. Evelyn Solomon confirmed. The title for the entire development, 2 acres, the clubhouse pit, and the executive residence transfers to Vance Utility Holdings, LLC. At noon tomorrow. Then Mark and Chloe need to be off the property before that happens. Solomon, I instructed. They need a deadline to understand the gravity of the situation. One want a formal eviction notice served immediately, stipulating a 24-hour window for the removal of personal property. Solomon agreed. By mid-morning, a sheriff's deputy and a notary arrived at the gate, serving Mark and Chloe the notice. The deputy, a polite, stoic man, didn't enter my property. He simply executed his duty on the other side of the fence. The notice was sharp and immediate: 24 hours to vacate. Any property remaining after noon the following day would be considered abandoned assets and subject to immediate disposal. The next 24 hours were the period of their true payment. It wasn't the payment of money. It was the payment of humiliation and loss. They were forced to reckon with their lavish life under the harsh, unblinking glare of the consequences. I sat on my porch, drinking coffee, watching their pathetic scramble from the cool distance of my restored peace. The executive residence was still without water or air conditioning, making their frantic packing effort an ordeal of sweat and desperation. Chloe, once so obsessed with her appearance, was now running around in a stained t-shirt, struggling to shove expensive designer gowns into cheap cardboard boxes. She was forced to abandon her massive, custom-built makeup vanity, too large to move quickly, and many of her precious, heavy pieces of imported Italian furniture. Mark, the man who had leveraged millions, could not even afford a professional moving truck. He made 2 frantic calls to friends who, having learned of his spectacular financial failure, suddenly had busy schedules. They were forced to load their few chosen belongings into a small, worn pickup truck they had borrowed from a low-level former employee. The irony was agonizingly slow and beautiful. They were stripping the sanctuary of their trinkets, leaving behind the massive, worthless, fixed assets they had stolen the land to acquire. Every item they chose to take was a testament to personal vanity, and every item they were forced to abandon was a symbol of their corporate greed. I watched Mark drag a custom-made, 7-foot mahogany bookshelf out of the house, only to realize he couldn't lift it into the pickup. After 20 minutes of fruitless struggle, he kicked the bookshelf, yelled a frustrated obscenity, "K," and left it broken on the lawn. He walked back inside, defeated, leaving the symbol of his abandoned knowledge and wisdom lying ruined in the dirt. They had been defined by their possessions. And now, their possessions defined their failure. The true price they were paying was the devaluation of their false life. As the sun began to set on their last day of ownership, I made one final, crucial move. I called Solomon and instructed him to issue a press release discreetly. Through the local business wire, the release simply stated, "Vance Utility Holdings, LLC has successfully assumed ownership of the former Vance Legacy Estates property, resolving critical public utility infrastructure threats. The company looks forward to utilizing the property to honor the true spirit of the Vance family legacy." This action ensured 2 things. First, that Mark and Chloe could not attempt any final defamatory public statement. And second, that the bank and the public saw the transfer as an act of civic duty, not personal vengeance. The matriarch had acted not out of spite, crud, but out of necessity. The morning of the deadline, the executive residence looked desolate. The house was a glass shell, half empty, the massive rooms echoing with the ghosts of their greed. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the noon deadline, Mark and Chloe emerged for the final time. They had only the clothes on their backs and 4 small duffel bags packed with essentials. The pickup truck was already full of the handful of items they salvaged. They walked slowly across the condemned lawn toward the gate, not looking back at the massive house that had been their undoing. As they reached the old gate, Mark stopped and looked toward my cottage. He didn't speak. He didn't beg. He simply offered a brief, strained native gesture of final, grudging acknowledgement of my absolute victory. Chloe, however, could not contain her final burst of bitterness. She grabbed the handle of the gate and looked directly at my porch. "You won, Evelyn," she spat, her voice tight with venom. "You won the land. But you'll be stuck here forever, guarding that stupid pipe. You'll die alone with your revenge." I simply raised the hand that held my glass of clear, cool water. "I will not die alone, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady and strong. "I will die free. And I will die on land that is honest. You, on the other hand, have no place left to go because you burned every bridge you tried to cross." The gates swung shut behind them, the heavy steel marking the definitive end of their era. Mark climbed into the driver's seat of the pickup, and Chloe slumped beside him. The truck drove slowly down the cypress-lined drive, the imported trees now serving only to frame their miserable retreat. At exactly noon, I watched the sheriff's deputy, who had been waiting at the gate, place a final lock on the development. The property was legally mine. The payment had been made. I didn't step onto the ruined land. I didn't need to inspect the damage. My victory was not the acquisition of the mansion, but the restoration of my sovereignty. The story could have ended there, the matriarch regaining her throne. But that would have been the victory of vengeance. My victory was meant to be one of liberation. I called Solomon and gave him the final instruction, the one I had planned since the moment I signed the deed. "Solomon, I want you to sell the entire property immediately. The executive residence, the condemned clubhouse pit, and all 2 acres. Sell it to a reputable conservation trust or a developer committed to low-impact housing. And I want the proceeds handled under a new foundation, the Arthur Vance Infrastructure Integrity Fund." I wasn't keeping the money. I was turning the stolen assets into a philanthropic legacy. The profit from their greed would now forever protect the integrity of the water line and benefit the public Mark tried to endanger. I stood on the porch, looking out not at the mansion, but at the horizon. I had the land. I had the money. I had secured my husband's legacy. Now I had my life back. I walked into my cottage, grabbed a small, worn leather satchel, and pulled out a set of keys I hadn't used in 20 years. They belonged to a beautiful, classic American roadster. I had restored long ago, a machine built for open highways and clear skies. I looked at the simple, honest walls of my cottage one last time. I had protected my home, but I was not going to be defined by it. I walked out to the garage, started the engine of the roadster, and listened to the satisfying, deep purr of freedom. I left the cottage locked, but not abandoned. I was leaving the past behind, using the restored legacy to fund the rest of my life. I drove slowly past the massive, silent, defeated executive residence, turning my back on the ruin and the revenge. The road ahead was long, open, and entirely my own. I didn't die alone with my revenge, Chloe. I drove away with my freedom, leaving the cost of your greed behind me. My life wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. The ultimate victory is not the moment your enemy falls. It is the moment you realize you are finally free to walk away. I had done what needed to be done. Justice was served. The betrayal was avenged. And the Vance legacy was protected not by hoarding wealth, but by turning that wealth into a lasting, ethical foundation. I stood in my garage, the air cool and dusty, the scent of motor oil and aged leather filling my lungs. Before me sat my true passion, a meticulously restored 1965 Ford Mustang convertible. It was Arthur's project and mine, a machine built for speed, durability, and the sheer joy of motion. It was the antithesis of the static, fragile luxury of the executive residence. The engine roared to life with a deep, confident rumble. That sound was the final curtain call on my years of quiet suffering. It was the sound of my future beginning. I had arranged everything. The deed to the entire development was now safely under the purview of the Arthur Vance Infrastructure Integrity Fund. The cottage was locked, insured, and left in the temporary care of Solomon, my attorney. I had packed only one small leather satchel containing essentials, a few family photos, and the original yellowed copy of the 1945 covenant, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the power of integrity. I drove the Mustang slowly down the driveway, passing the silent, glass-walled ruin of the mansion. I didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, resolute sense of peace. The house was no longer a symbol of betrayal. It was just a building, soon to be repurposed for a greater good. I paused briefly at the massive, wrought iron gate of the sanctuary. The heavy steel was meant to keep the world out, but now it served only to frame my exit. I looked down the long cypress-lined boulevard. The road Mark had built with stolen money. I engaged the clutch, pressed the accelerator, and left the silence behind. The moment the tires hit the main highway, the world exploded into vibrant, unfiltered motion. The wind immediately whipped my hair, and the sun hit my face with a warmth I hadn't truly felt in years, warmth not of heat, but of liberation. I pushed the car past the city limits, watching the familiar structures of my past life shrink in the rearview mirror. I was leaving behind the duty, the expectation, and the resentment. I was driving toward the absolute sovereignty of the open road. For decades, my identity had been defined by my roles: wife, mother, aunt, caretaker, and, secretly, the custodian of a massive family legacy. Now, I was none of those things. I was simply Evelyn Vance, 72 years old, heading north toward the vast, untamed beauty of the American West. My first destination was the Pacific Coast Highway, a road Arthur and I had always promised to drive, but never found the time. Time, I realized, was the only currency that truly mattered. And I was now infinitely rich. As the miles melted away, I thought about Chloe's final bitter curse: "You'll die alone with your revenge." She had missed the point entirely. Revenge had been a necessary tool, a surgical act required to restore balance. But the goal was never to guard a pipe or haunt a mansion. The goal was to secure the means for this very moment. Pure, unencumbered self-discovery. I stopped at a small roadside diner in rural Oklahoma, place Mark and Chloe would have considered too vulgar to breathe the air near. I sat at a booth, ordered a simple, perfect slice of apple pie and strong black coffee. While waiting, I checked my phone. It buzzed with alerts from Solomon. The transfer was complete. The trust was funded. The paperwork was final. The money that had defined Mark's corruption was now defined by my freedom. I had the means to live anywhere, do anything for the rest of my life. I had the power to make my final decades an adventure. I looked at the simple, honest faces of the people around me: travelers, truckers, local families. They were living their lives day by day, defined not by their assets but by their choices. This was the true legacy Arthur had wanted for me. Not to be a prisoner of wealth, but a patron of liberty. My final enduring lesson was this: you must be strong enough to protect your peace, and wise enough to enjoy it. The strength came from the 1945 covenant and the unwavering ethical foundation Arthur had built. The wisdom came from understanding that the mansion was never the prize. The prize was the Mustang, the open highway, and the time I had stolen back from my betrayers. I finished my coffee. I left a generous tip, small act of kindness I could now afford without sacrificing my security. As I drove out of the parking lot, shifting the gears of the magnificent old car, I saw a wide, empty stretch of highway curving up toward the mountains. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, painting the road ahead in the color of promise. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the solid, honest power of the engine beneath my fingertips. My life wasn't ending in quiet desperation. It was beginning with a full tank of gas and a spirit reborn. The matriarch had done her duty. Now the woman was finally embarking on her own great American adventure. The path ahead was unknown, the freedom was absolute, and the future was boundless. I smiled, a genuine, deep, radiating smile of pure joy. I pushed the accelerator down, merging onto the open road, leaving the betrayal, the mansion, and the entire past squarely in my dust.